Well, the economic survey is very much a snapshot at what a lot of people would expect to be reflected clearly in the budget tomorrow. It gives you an overall idea of where the economy is headed, and therefore if one were to guess what might actually come tomorrow, then I would suggest that some of it might be a fair guess. But I think the overall story is one of optimism. 6 to 6.8%. India among the fastest growing economies in the world, certainly at this stage. And whether it's tax revenues, which is up, greater capital expenditure spending, sustainable debt to GDP ratio, there are a lot of positives in it. But what are some of the challenges, or are we on the verge of actually getting into a really good period of growth for the next several years? To talk about that, the President of the Confederation of Indian Industry, Sanjeev Bajaj, thanks very much, and the Director General, Mr. Chandrajit Banerjee. Mr. Bajaj, let me come to you first. I found it interesting. In fact, for the last couple of years, all that we've been doing is we've been talking about the pandemic and the impact, Are we through with it? Now, this report actually says no more pandemic talk, essentially. The recovery is complete, right? So is that over and done and dusted as far as our economy is concerned?
Well, very clearly the survey seems to say that. And if you look at the last if you look at the last few quarters, it does look like we're at the end of it. You can never be 100% sure, but if you even look at what WHO mentioned recently, that while they are still on alert, they believe we are close to the end. We are also seeing with China opening up, a significant part of the global economy slowing down, and the supply chain constraints was because you had to close China. So when you look at a combination of these factors, there is a very high likelihood, with the exception of the war that's happening, that could end up being a negative trigger, but assuming that comes under control as well, that we are at the end of this period of 3 years which saw tremendous amount of challenges, and we can set ourselves up for the coming years, for the coming decade of growth.
So 6.8%, I mean, that more or less matches what several international institutions are also talking about. But for context, it's among the fastest. It is the fastest, right, among developing economies in the world. So I suppose the question therefore is this where we are at, or do you actually see it going beyond that to 7.5%? Because, it was suggested that this is actually the lower end of the expectation. It might actually be more.
No, I think this is a very realistic estimate for this year, and I think it's a good growth rate for this year. As you said, that the fastest growing emerging economy, fastest growing large economy actually. And actually, the way one sees it is we ourselves are estimated it anywhere between 6.5 to 7.
Right.
And if we look at the type of surveys that we have had with industry, the expectations are pretty much, the economic survey, the expectations of the industry was also the same. And it really sets in motion what you said, us prepared for a growth rate which will be much higher in the next few years to come. Because this particular growth rate, as you appreciate, is coming on a higher base compared to the previous one. So there is, and the corporate bottom lines, as you've seen in the economic survey as well as our surveys, shows that there is strong appetite for a strong bottom line and strong appetite for going ahead with private sector investment.
Mr. Bajaj, retail inflation is a cause of concern. 7.8% in April, that's well above the RBI's guideline, the tolerance limit, which is what, 6%. But the budget, the economic survey says, and I quote, however, one of the lowest in the world. Now, we shouldn't necessarily be happy with the fact that it's one of the lowest in the world. I think it is a challenge, right, even now.
So it's very clearly a recognition that we are no longer isolated from the world. Right. And instead, as you know, most of our inflation is imported, because it's relating to oil prices, and there is a level of uncertainty. There are both positives and negatives. If the world is going into a recession, commodity prices have to come down.
Right.
But if China is going to go back growing, it's going to start consuming.
Right.
So there will be some of these uncertainties there, and that's where I think we now need to see greater fiscal prudence, because the largesse that was necessary over the last 3 years, as we are coming now towards the end of that cycle, has to now give way to greater fiscal prudence, both on the monetary side as well as on the fiscal side.
Sure.
And as we do that, we have to bring inflation down to a number that RBI is comfortable with, maybe right in the middle of its band.
So where are we with that? Because it's an ongoing process. So, I mean, within the next 1 year, you're confident of us going beneath that 6% threshold?
Assuming that we don't see any externalities which are significantly negative, I think we have a very good chance to be strongly within that band in this coming year.
So despite the China situation and the Ukraine conflict, you believe over the next 1 year, we might be able to bring inflation under 6%?
We could, yes.
Is that something you share?
You see,
sense of optimism?
no, I share that because, we would see a lot happening on, the prudence of the government in terms of, you see, there's a lot been done on the monetary side.
Yeah.
Now, if you really look at what can be done otherwise also is important. And I would see that inflation getting slowly, I mean, even the economic survey says that it is contained.
Yeah.
And now I would think that it can really focus on doing away with some of the non-merit subsidies, so to say. So while the one which are important, food, water, sanitation, etc., it'll go on. But then we need to see how we can really go into a different level of macroeconomic fundamentals in the budget making.
Sure.
And in that areas like the non-merit subsidies, we need to start addressing them. Part of it has been started with the reforms process, but taking forward, looking at the fertilizer, the way it is handled, or power, etc., we would see that those are areas of intervention that one would look at, and I think that itself will also really help what just Sanjeev mentioned.
You know, Mr. Bajaj, I found this interesting. When they're talking about medium-term growth, there were some interesting comparisons that were made. Again, let me quote from the economic survey. The situation is analogous to 1998 to 2002, when transformative reforms had lagged growth returns due to temporary shocks. Once these faded, there were growth dividends. So in our context, the present context, presumably COVID is that shock, right? The war continues. I'm not sure if that war, if that shock is over. It will be over for in a finite period of time. But I think this seems to suggest that we are now headed to major growth over, let's say, the next decade or so. Is that your sense as well?
We clearly are seeing the foundation being set.
Foundation of what exactly?
So when you look at the foundation, one, very significant improvement in our infrastructure. Makes a very big difference on logistics and increasing efficiencies once the product leaves the factory gates.
Right.
Second, if you look at the PLI schemes, these are ending up just providing an initial boost to a set of sectors where we have both capability and capacity.
Right.
That is something that should help benefit us, and we are starting to see that already in autos and in electronics. Third, on the ease of doing business, while there's a lot that has been done, we believe a lot more needs to be done to further decriminalize business laws, simplify interaction between state and center, because eventually investments come in the state. So greater coordination there, like what we've seen with the GST Council. Why can't we have similar ones for land, labor, water, energy, and simplify and make it easy for businesses to set up industry? So combination of these factors will lay that strong foundation for growth, because keep in mind the world is looking for an alternative.
Right, right. Gross non-performing assets, that's fallen to a 7-year low of 5%. So that's great news in a sense, right? Because this has been something that's been really holding us back.
Indeed, absolutely, and that's we see that to be a very important indicator. I think, and that also gives the space to the government to really move forward more. And I think that's one of the major indicators of the economic survey. And for the first time, we are seeing it to be in such a rate, such a low rate. Sure. So it's again something which shows that the report card in many aspects is good, and this is one very important point that we see pretty well reflected upon.
Mr. Bajaj, let's talk about two things which are going to be a part of our economy now forever. One, digitalization, and secondly, climate change and energy independence. So let's talk about digitalization first. At one level, it is becoming a bedrock of our economic growth. So it transforms ease of doing business, it transforms social inclusion, etc., etc. But there's still a digital divide. There are any number of people in our country who don't want to invest in a smartphone right now. And our growth through digitalization is premised on that availability. How do we go beyond that?
So a couple of things over there. Firstly, let's keep in mind that we probably still have amongst the highest penetration of combination of the digital bank accounts, Aadhaar, which is the digital ID, and low-cost data or bandwidth compared to most of the countries around the world. Look at something as simple as digital payments. Today, by some counts, we account for 40% of global digital payments on a monthly basis. 6 to 7 billion transactions, I think, a month, more than US and China put together. Somebody was telling me, throw in Europe as well.
Right.
So it is showing that if you get digitalization right and at the right cost, and that's where your point on smartphone comes, it can make a very big difference. What we have to do is today smartphone prices get controlled outside of India. Most of them are made in China. We have to start making the components in India. That's when we'll drive costs down. We are also starting to see that on the phones which are not as smart as the smartphones, a number of new digital features coming out.
Yes.
So there are a number of initiatives being driven in that direction as well. So combination of those factors will ensure greater inclusion and equity and access.
You know, the auto sector is, it's a bit of a cliche, but it's true, is a driver of the economy. I mean, so much is linked to that. But the auto sector in India is greatly dependent on semiconductor availability and smart chip availability. We have a huge lag in terms of the availability of cars, not because demand is low, but because demand is super high, and we've been unable to do that. Imports from Taiwan, it's challenging at the best of times. How much of our growth in the transport sector is premised on India becoming a champion at manufacturing semiconductors?
It's not just the auto sector; it's across all sectors, and I think that's some. I mean, we cannot. The pandemic and the post-pandemic times have shown us that we cannot be dependent on that. And we have seen several challenges with our dependence on it, not again beyond the auto sector too. Therefore, if we really look at the present levels of discussions and again the private sector and the government working together and looking at as to how to really bring in chip manufacturing or semiconductors into India, I think we are pretty much on stream. And as was I was mentioning today, an iPhone 14 getting manufactured in India, and therefore we need to have definitely a very strong presence of chip manufacturing in our country. Number one. Number two, will not be only for our country. Probably
for export as well.
It can be a big for exports as well. But in this there has to be a lot of if one can say jugalbandi between the government and India, government and private sector, because this is one sector where you need a lot in terms of land, in terms of the investment is pretty high. So I think today we see a good movement in that direction. There are already, as you know, there are indicators that we will be able to do it, and it takes a period. It takes some time.
Right.
It cannot be just start tomorrow. It is at the click of a button. And I think it's good that we are seeing good sort of action between the private sector as well as the government on this.
Mr. Bajaj, climate change, we've got a net zero pledge already in place, which is great, but it's still a pledge. It has to be followed through completely. But I found one very interesting statistic. 2047 energy independence, courtesy the National Green Hydrogen Mission. How important is green hydrogen, for our future?
It's going to play a very important role, as much as renewable energy from the sun or the wind will play, and a balance on fossil fuel usage as well. So what we have to do is to look at our energy strategy across all these resources.
Yeah.
We know that currently green hydrogen is expensive, there are storage issues, but there is significant innovation happening in that area, and this is one of the areas where India can work with academia, with other countries to build innovation in India. For too long have we actually only produced to innovation built in the West, and there were many reasons for that. But as we are seeing completely new challenges, but also new sectors of opportunities come up, we have to see how can we work on those together and find ways to make green hydrogen available in large quantities and at cheap values. But let's keep in mind that, as I mentioned, it has to be across the different I would say, raw materials or sources of energy.
Yeah. A final question to both of you, because I suspect this is what our viewers really want to know. They'll know tomorrow, obviously, if there's any change in the income tax rates, the tax slabs, etc., etc. Are you optimistic that they may be? I'm asking you to guess. So don't say that, how will I know? But I'm asking you to take a guess. Do you believe it's the right time?
So I think number one, the government has adequately focused and has talked about spurring demand, investment demand. I think the need for also spurring consumption demand is going to be very, very critical and important. And therefore, we all heard the finance minister say that I know the issues of the middle class. So that really raises hope, so to say. And therefore, one would expect, and what we have also been recommending is to boost consumption demand.
But it is a CII recommendation.
That's right. It's a CII recommendation that the lower tax bracket, we see some relaxation in the over there, so that there is more disposable income at hand. And you know what's required now, and why is it so important for us? It's not just consumption demand getting boosted, but post-COVID, you see the healthcare spend has risen significantly. Yes. So I think keeping those in mind, the government might look at really looking at least that section for the middle class, the lower end of the to have some changes.
Beyond the middle class, are you optimistic of a more spread out change of slabs or interest, rates going down?
Not really, because we believe the government also has to balance its fiscal management. So we have to bring fiscal deficit down. So this is not the time where they can go expansionary. They've already done that in the last few years. Right. So we are hopeful that at the lower end, people have suffered the most for understandable reasons, and that's where they get some relief.
Wonderful talking to both of you. Let's see what tomorrow holds. Well, there you have it, a look at the economic survey. We've actually covered quite a lot. We haven't got into specific areas like services or manufacturing. We'll have a lot of time to do that tomorrow. But just in terms of the overall state of the Indian economy, there is a sense of optimism. It's driven by some pretty impressive numbers. Are we on the path to sustained economic growth, analogous to what we saw between 1998 and 2002? Or will that take some more time? That we'll figure that out in some time. But I think the bottom line as far as this survey is concerned is recovery complete. The talk of pandemic is over. That's what the government believes. Back to the studio.